The wine hit Hannah Mitchell's dress before she even registered Connor Whitfield's hand moving toward her tray. It happened fast and deliberate, the way cruelty dressed as accident always does. A careless swing of his arm as she passed with a full tray of champagne, a glass tipping directly into the front of her uniform, red wine blooming dark and sudden across white fabric in front of 200 of Crestwood's wealthiest guests. The string quartet faltered for half a beat. Chandelier light caught the wet stain spreading down her front, and for one frozen second, the entire Whitfield Foundation gala held its breath. Then Connor laughed. It was loud, performative, the kind of laugh designed to invite an audience rather than express genuine amusement, and it worked exactly as he intended. A ripple of uncertain chuckles spreading outward from his table, guests glancing at each other for permission before deciding it was safe, even fashionable, to join in. Hannah stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom floor, the tray trembling slightly in her hands, humiliation crawling up her spine in a room specifically designed, with its marble floors and gold-leafed ceiling, to remind her exactly where she stood in it. "Oh, come on," Connor said, loud enough to carry, gesturing at her ruined dress with theatrical apology that fooled absolutely nobody. "Lighten up. It's just a uniform." The smell of red wine and crushed grapes filled the air around her, mixing with the perfume of 200 guests and the faint smoke of the gala's signature cigars drifting from the terrace doors. Somewhere behind her, another server hissed a sympathetic word she couldn't quite catch over the ringing in her ears. Hannah had been humiliated before. Quietly, privately, in the particular way the world humiliates women whose bodies it has already decided aren't worth protecting. But never like this, never staged for an audience that found her discomfort entertaining enough to laugh along with a rich man's son. She set the tray down on the nearest table with hands that refused to stop shaking, and opened her mouth to say something, anything, though she already knew from years of swallowing smaller cruelties that nothing she said in this room would matter. She never got the chance to find out. A chair scraped back at the head table, the sound sharp enough to cut through the laughter entirely. Alexander Stone rose to his full height, and the temperature of the ballroom seemed to drop with him. Every guest in that room knew exactly who he was, even if half of them had never actually heard him speak. The man who never attended galas, who'd accepted this particular invitation for reasons nobody had bothered questioning, whose name alone made certain men at certain tables quietly check the location of the nearest exit. He crossed the ballroom floor without hurrying, his footsteps echoing against the marble in a silence that had swallowed the laughter whole. Connor's smile faltered as Alexander stopped directly beside Hannah, close enough that she could smell rain on his coat, far enough that she understood, even through her shock, that he wasn't crowding her on purpose. Alexander raised one hand and pointed directly at her. "Mine," he said. One word. No explanation. The ballroom went so silent that the string quartet's abandoned final note seemed to hang in the air indefinitely. Connor's laughter died entirely, replaced by confusion sliding rapidly toward alarm. Mr. Stone, I don't think you understand, this was just a joke, she's not just anything," Alexander said, his voice low and absolute, carrying to every corner of the room without needing to rise in volume. "And you just humiliated her in front of 200 people for sport, which tells me everything I need to know about exactly what kind of man you actually are." Hannah stared up at him, utterly bewildered, wine still dripping slowly down the front of her dress. She had never seen this man before in her life. She had certainly never given him any reason to claim her publicly in front of the most powerful families in the city, with a single possessive word that should have terrified her and instead inexplicably didn't. "I don't understand," she said quietly, her voice the only thing breaking the silence besides her own racing pulse. "I don't know you." "I know," Alexander said, and something in his expression, careful, almost gentle, entirely at odds with the fear rippling through the rest of the room, softened just slightly. "But I've spent 15 years looking for you, and I am not about to stand here and let this family treat you like something they can spill wine on for entertainment." Connor's father, Gregory Whitfield, was already moving toward them from his table near the stage, his expression caught between fury and the particular panic of a man realizing his son had just provoked someone he genuinely could not afford to provoke. "Alexander," he said, voice tight with forced civility, "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding that we can settle privately." "There's nothing private about what your son just did," Alexander said, not looking away from Hannah. 200 witnesses just watched it happen. I think they deserve to watch what happens next, too. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs, wine-soaked fabric clinging cold to her skin. 200 faces watching her with an entirely different kind of attention than the dismissive glances she'd grown used to over years of working rooms exactly like this one. She had no idea, standing frozen in the wreckage of her own humiliation, that the man who just claimed her in front of the city's wealthiest families had spent 15 years carrying a debt to a father she'd buried years ago, or that the family who just humbled her for sport was about to discover exactly how much danger they'd invited by doing it. Hannah Mitchell had spent 6 years becoming professionally invisible, and until tonight she'd considered it the safest skill she'd ever developed. She worked events for Bramwell Catering, the kind of company wealthy families hired specifically because its staff knew how to move through a room without ever becoming part of it. Refilling glasses, clearing plates, anticipating needs before anyone bothered voicing them, present in the exact way furniture is present, necessary and entirely beneath notice. She'd worked the Whitfield Gala for 3 consecutive years, had served drinks to half the room without a single guest ever learning her name, and had built an entire quiet life around the assumption that nobody in rooms like this one would ever look at her twice. It hadn't always felt like a curse. Her father, Daniel Mitchell, had taught her early that being underestimated had its uses, though he'd never explained, not once in the 17 years she'd had with him before the heart attack took him at 52, exactly what kind of life had taught him that particular lesson so thoroughly. He'd worked logistics for a shipping company, or so he'd always said, vague enough about the specifics that Hannah had never thought to question it until years after his death, when she found a small leather ledger in his desk drawer filled with numbers and names that meant nothing to her and everything apparently to someone else. She'd kept the ledger. She'd never known why until tonight. "You all right?" Priya, another server, whispered, pressing a clean towel into Hannah's shaking hands the moment the ballroom's attention finally, mercifully, began to drift elsewhere. "That man, do you actually know him?" "No," Hannah said, dabbing uselessly at the wine soaking through her dress. "I've never met him in my life." It would have been easy, in another version of this night, for the humiliation to simply sit there unresolved, Connor's cruelty unanswered, the laughter unchallenged, Hannah quietly finishing her shift and going home to cry about it the way she'd cried about 100 smaller cruelties before. Instead, the gala's coordinator, flustered and overcompensating, offered Hannah the rest of the night off with full pay, an offer Hannah suspected had considerably more to do with Alexander Stone's continued presence at the edge of the room than any genuine concern for her well-being. She refused it. "I'll finish my shift," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "I'm not going to let him decide I can't do my job." It wasn't a dramatic reversal. Nobody applauded. But Priya's expression shifted into something like respect, and across the ballroom Alexander Stone, who had not stopped watching her since the moment he sat back down, noted the refusal with an attention considerably sharper than simple curiosity. He found her 20 minutes later, near the service hallway where she'd retreated to wring out the worst of the wine from her dress, the chandelier light replaced by the harsher fluorescence of the staff corridor, the smell of polished marble giving way to bleach and stacked linens. "You didn't take the night off," he said. "I don't quit because someone decided I should be embarrassed," Hannah said. "I've had a lot of practice not quitting." "I imagine you have." Alexander studied her for a long moment, something careful and deliberate in the way he held himself, like a man accustomed to giving away considerably less than he was thinking. "Your name's Hannah Mitchell." "How do you know that?" "Because I've been looking for it for 15 years, Alexander said. "Your father was Daniel Mitchell." The hallway seemed to tilt slightly beneath her. "How do you know my father's name?" "He saved my life once," Alexander said simply. "A deal that went wrong in a warehouse on Harrow Street 15 years ago, before either of us knew the other's name. He got me out, disappeared before I could repay him, and I spent 15 years trying to find the man who'd done it. I only learned 6 months ago that he'd passed away. I didn't know he'd left behind a daughter until I watched Whitfield humiliate her in front of 200 people tonight." Hannah's hands stilled on the damp towel. "My father never worked in anything like that. He did logistics. Shipping schedules." "He did," Alexander said. "For people who needed someone who understood numbers well enough to move things nobody else could track. I think you might understand more about that than you realize." He nodded toward the leather ledger visible at the edge of her open catering binder, the one she'd carried into every gala for the past 2 years without fully understanding why she still bothered keeping it close. "That's my father's," Hannah said, suddenly defensive, pulling the binder closer. "It's just old shipping logs. It doesn't mean anything." "I think it might mean considerably more than either of us realizes," Alexander said quietly. "And I think the family that just humiliated you tonight is about to discover exactly how much." Alexander Stone did not attend galas, and he certainly did not explain himself to strangers, which made the last hour, by every measure he understood about his own carefully controlled life, considerably out of character. He'd accepted the Whitfield Foundation's invitation for one reason that had nothing to do with charity. For the past 8 months, his organization had been quietly building a case against Gregory Whitfield's foundation for laundering charitable donations through a network of shell vendors, money that should have funded hospital wings and scholarship programs instead routing back into Whitfield family accounts through inflated catering and event contracts nobody outside the family had ever bothered to question. Tonight's gala was meant to be a reconnaissance. He hadn't expected to find Daniel Mitchell's daughter serving wine in the middle of it. He found his head of operations, Desmond Cole, near the bar an hour later and laid out exactly what he needed. "Pull everything we have on Bramwell Catering's contracts with the Whitfield Foundation," Alexander said. "And find out everything you can about a woman named Hannah Mitchell, quietly, without alerting anyone." "The waitress," Desmond said, something unreadable flickering across his face before settling back into careful neutrality. "You're certain that's worth the attention, boss? Could be nothing." "It's not nothing," Alexander said. "Her father saved my life once. I'm not in the habit of treating that debt as nothing." Desmond nodded and moved to comply, and Alexander told himself the brief hesitation he'd seen cross his most trusted associate's face meant nothing at all. The same dismissal, he would later understand, that had cost Nathan Cross 4 months in an entirely different city, the kind of mistake men in his position made when they assumed loyalty was a fixed quantity rather than something that required watching. What came back about Hannah within 2 days surprised him considerably. She'd been quietly auditing Bramwell Catering's event budgets for the past year, a responsibility nobody had formally assigned her but that she'd taken on anyway after noticing, with the same careful attention that made her excellent at her actual job, that several major gala contracts carried line items that didn't match the actual costs of anything delivered. She'd flagged the discrepancies to her supervisor 4 months ago. Nothing had come of it. The supervisor, it turned out, received a personal consulting fee from the Whitfield Foundation twice a year that made further inquiry considerably less appealing than simply letting the matter drop. Alexander found her in the catering company's small back office 2 days later, reviewing a stack of invoices with the same unhurried precision she'd shown in the gala's staff corridor. "You flagged the Whitfield contracts 4 months ago," he said from the doorway. Hannah looked up, startled but not entirely surprised. "How do you know that?" "Because I've spent 8 months building a case that proves exactly what you noticed," Alexander said, stepping into the cramped office, the smell of old coffee and printer ink replacing the gala's chandelier-lit elegance entirely. "Your supervisor buried it. I think you already suspected why." "I suspected he didn't want the headache," Hannah said carefully. "I didn't think it went any further than that." "It goes considerably further than that," Alexander said. "The Whitfields have been laundering donation money through inflated event contracts for at least 3 years. Catering, florals, security, all of it overbilled, the difference funneled back into family accounts disguised as foundation expenses. I think the documents you flagged might be the piece I've been missing." Hannah set down the invoice in her hand, processing the shape of what he was actually telling her. "If I hand those over to you and this turns into whatever it is you do," she said slowly, "I lose my job, possibly my entire career in this industry. The Whitfields aren't the only wealthy family Bramwell caters for." "I know," Alexander said. "I'm not going to pretend that's not a real cost." "Then why would I do it?" "Because you already did the hard part months ago," Alexander said. "You noticed something nobody else bothered looking for and you tried to fix it the right way before anyone gave you a reason to think the right way wouldn't work. I'm offering you a way to finish what you have already started, not asking you to begin something new." That evening, at a tense sit-down with 2 captains from a rival outfit testing whether Alexander's organization had grown distracted enough to challenge, Alexander found his attention splitting in a way it hadn't in years. Half the conversation devoted to dock leasing terms, the other half occupied by the quiet, steady image of a woman who'd spent months trying to do the right thing in a system designed to bury her for it. He ended the meeting earlier than planned, citing other business, and found himself, against every instinct of careful restraint he'd built over 15 years running an organization that survived on exactly that restraint, driving back toward Bramwell Catering's offices instead of home. He told himself it was strategic. He was beginning to suspect, uncomfortably, that it wasn't entirely true. The connection between them deepened over the following 2 weeks in careful, deliberate conversations that both of them initially framed as business and neither of them, eventually, bothered pretending it was only that. Alexander visited the catering office most evenings, ostensibly to review the documents Hannah was slowly, methodically organizing into a case file that grew more damning by the day. The small office smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and the lavender hand cream Hannah kept in her desk drawer, rain ticking steadily against the single window most nights, a portable radio in the corner tuned low to a jazz station nobody had chosen on purpose. He told her in careful pieces about the warehouse on Harrow Street 15 years ago. A deal gone violently wrong, 3 men dead before her father, a stranger to him then, had pulled him through a service door and into an alley before the rest could finish the job. He told her about the 15 years of searching that followed, every lead going cold, until a Whitfield Gala and a spilled glass of wine had finally closed the distance. "Why didn't you ever find him while he was alive?" Hannah asked one evening, the question she'd been circling for days finally surfacing. "He didn't want to be found," Alexander said. "I understand that better now than I did then. A man who saves someone like me usually has good reasons for disappearing afterward rather than collecting on it." "He never told me any of this," Hannah said. "I grew up thinking he scheduled shipping routes for a living." "Maybe he did eventually," Alexander said. "People who survive things like Harrow Street usually spend the rest of their lives trying to build something ordinary enough to forget it happened." Hannah considered that for a long moment, turning her father's old ledger over in her hands, the leather worn soft from years of handling she'd never understood the reason for. "He used to say numbers don't forget even when people do," she said quietly. "I always thought he meant it about bookkeeping. I think I understand it differently now." When Alexander offered several days later to simply have his lawyers arrange a quiet settlement that would cover any income Hannah lost once the case against the Whitfields became public, she shook her head. "I don't want it handled before I understand exactly what I'm agreeing to," she said. "If you make the consequences disappear before I've decided what I'm actually willing to risk, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I made a real choice or just followed yours. Let me decide what I'm risking. Don't decide it for me." Alexander studied her for a long moment, recalibrating, the way he kept finding himself recalibrating around her. "All right," he said. "You decide. I'll support whatever you choose." Connor Whitfield found her 3 days later outside Bramwell's offices, his earlier bravado replaced by something considerably more nervous, glancing repeatedly toward the street as though expecting Alexander's men to materialize from the shadows. "You need to drop whatever you're doing with Stone," Connor said, blocking her path to her car. "My father's lawyers are already building a case that you've been embezzling from the Foundation's events. It would be a lot easier for everyone if you just disappeared from this quietly, the same way your little audit should have disappeared 4 months ago." "I didn't embezzle anything," Hannah said, backing up a step despite herself, the cold metal of her car door pressing against her back. "I flagged a discrepancy your family created." "Doesn't matter what's true," Connor said. "Matters what people believe when my father's lawyers are the ones presenting it. You should have stayed invisible. Nobody humiliates Whitfield publicly and walks away clean." "You humiliated yourself," Hannah said, steadier than she expected. "I just happened to be standing there when it happened." Connor's expression twisted and he stepped closer, hand closing hard around her wrist. And that was the exact moment a car door slammed somewhere behind them, 2 of Alexander's men crossing the lot fast enough that Connor released her grip and stumbled backward before either of them reached him. "Mr. Whitfield," one of the men said, voice flat. "You're going to want to leave now." Connor left without another word, his earlier menace collapsed into something considerably more frightened, and Hannah stood in the parking lot afterward, pulse hammering, watching his car peel away into traffic. It would have been a clean enough warning shot, if the Whitfields hadn't decided within the week that quiet threats weren't going to be enough. The accusation arrived 11 days later in the worst possible setting Gregory Whitfield could have engineered. The foundation's spring fundraising luncheon, 200 guests gathered again in the same gilded ballroom, Hannah present only to oversee Bramwell's catering staff for what should have been a routine afternoon shift. The two police detectives arrived precisely as dessert service began, moving through the room with the deliberate, attention-grabbing pace of men who'd been specifically instructed to make a scene rather than handle the matter quietly. "Hannah Mitchell," one of them said loud enough to turn every head in the room. "We need you to come with us. We have a warrant related to embezzlement from the Whitfield Foundation's donation accounts." The room went silent in a way that felt sickeningly familiar. The same collective attention that had once watched wine soak through her dress now watching her face drain of color entirely. I haven't taken anything," Hannah said, her voice carrying despite the panic closing around her throat. "I flagged discrepancies months ago. I never touched the accounts. We have documentation showing unauthorized transfers traced to your personal banking information," the second detective said, already producing handcuffs with theatrical slowness that suggested someone had specifically requested this particular humiliation be drawn out as long as possible. "You can explain the rest downtown." Gregory Whitfield stood near the stage, his expression carefully arranged into solemn regret, the performance of a man reluctantly forced to confront an employee's betrayal rather than a man who'd just orchestrated exactly this outcome. Connor stood beside him, and Hannah caught for one brief unguarded second before he composed himself, the unmistakable flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "This is fabricated," Hannah said, backing away as the detective reached for her wrist, the cold metal of the cuffs glinting under the chandelier light. "Someone planted those transfers. I have records that prove exactly the opposite of what you're accusing me of." "Then you can show us those records at the station," the detective said. It was Alexander's voice, low and absolute, that cut through the room before the cuffs ever closed. "She's not going anywhere with you." He crossed the ballroom floor with the same unhurried, devastating calm he'd shown the night of the wine, two of his own men flanking the detectives before either could object, a third already producing a tablet that he set directly in front of the lead detective's face. "Before you arrest a woman for embezzlement," Alexander said, "you might want to see what she actually found. 3 years of inflated event contracts, donation funds rerouted through shell vendors registered to addresses that trace directly back to Gregory Whitfield's personal real estate holdings. The transfers you think implicate her were authorized using login credentials that were issued the same week she flagged the original discrepancy to a supervisor who happens to receive a biannual consulting fee from this very foundation. I'd suggest checking who actually benefited from making her look guilty before you finish writing that warrant." The detective scrolled through the documents with a growing visible alarm, the ballroom's 200 guests watching the entire reversal unfold in real time, the same room that had laughed at Connor's joke now utterly silent with an entirely different kind of attention. "This is outrageous," Gregory Whitfield said, his composure finally cracking. "Alexander, you cannot simply—" "I can," Alexander said, "and I have because unlike your family I don't need to fabricate evidence to make my case. Everything on that tablet is real, documented, and considerably more damning than whatever your lawyers prepared for today." The detectives exchanged a long, uncertain look, the handcuffs lowering slowly as the weight of what they'd nearly done settled into the room. It should have been the end of the immediate threat. Instead, as the detective stepped back to confer privately, Hannah's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize, the message arriving with sickening, deliberate timing. "Your little audit didn't account for everything. Ask Stone, who's actually been protecting the Whitfields all along. Some debts go both directions." Hannah stared at the message, her relief at the avoided arrest curdling instantly into a colder, more specific dread. She turned to find Alexander already watching her expression shift, his own composure faltering for the first time since the night of the gala. "What is it?" he said. "Someone just told me," Hannah said slowly, "that one of your own people has been protecting the Whitfields the entire time." "Alexander, who else knew about the documents before tonight? Who actually arranged for the detectives to be here?" Alexander's expression went very still, the same recalculation she'd watched cross his face once before, except this time it landed somewhere considerably more personal. "Desmond," he said quietly. Hannah didn't wait for Alexander to fully process the second betrayal before she started working the only way she'd ever known how, methodically, precisely, the same patient attention that had let her notice a discrepancy nobody else bothered checking now turned fully toward proving exactly how deep it ran. "I need everything Desmond has touched since you started investigating the Whitfields," she said, pulling out her father's old ledger alongside her own meticulous catering audit files, spreading them across Alexander's desk with the same unhurried confidence she'd once reserved for balancing impossible event budgets. "If he's been tipping them off, there's a pattern. There's always a pattern. People who think they're being careful are usually just being predictable." Alexander listed out every meeting Desmond had attended, every piece of information he'd had access to, and Hannah cross-referenced it against the timeline of the Whitfields' countermoves. The framing attempt, the timing of the detective's arrival, the suspiciously specific knowledge of exactly which documents would be most damaging to discredit. The pattern emerged within the hour. Every major setback in Alexander's investigation had occurred within days of a private briefing Desmond had personally requested with Senator Holbrook, a political ally of Gregory Whitfield's whose committee oversaw exactly the kind of financial oversight that could quietly bury a laundering investigation before it ever reached prosecutors. "He's not just protecting them," Hannah said. "He's trading information for political favors. Probably positioning himself for something bigger once this all settles. A campaign contribution, an appointment, something Holbrook can deliver once the Whitfields are safely out of trouble." Alexander's fury, watching 15 years of careful trust resolve into betrayal, was quiet and absolute. "He's been with me longer than almost anyone in my organization," he said. "I never once thought to verify whether his loyalty had a price." "Nobody checks the people they've stopped questioning," Hannah said. "That's exactly the mistake the Whitfields made with their supervisor's consulting fee. It's the same mistake, just wearing a better suit." Desmond Cole, confronted that same evening in Alexander's office with the documented timeline Hannah had assembled, didn't bother denying it once the pattern was laid bare in front of him. "Holbrook offered me considerably more than loyalty to you was ever going to pay," he said simply. "You'd have done the same thing in my position 15 years ago, before you decided debts to dead men mattered more than your own future." "Don't," Alexander said, his voice dropping into something dangerously quiet, "compare what I owe Daniel Mitchell to whatever you sold me out for." The confrontation that followed happened fast, Desmond reaching for a weapon he'd kept concealed since arriving, the office erupting into sudden chaos, Alexander's other men flooding in from the hallway, the brief, violent scuffle ending almost as quickly as it began. Desmond disarmed and pinned before he managed more than a single wild shot that shattered a window overlooking the harbor. It was Hannah, not Alexander, who noticed Desmond reaching for a second weapon hidden at his ankle while everyone's attention remained fixed on the first. And it was Hannah who threw herself forward, knocking Alexander sideways out of the line of fire half a second before Desmond's hand closed around the hidden blade, the two of them crashing into the side of the desk as Alexander's men finally wrestled Desmond fully to the ground. "You're all right?" Alexander asked, pulling her up, his hands finding her shoulders with an urgency that betrayed considerably more than professional concern. "I'm all right," Hannah said, breathless, adrenaline still flooding her system. He wasn't finished. "I saw it before anyone else did." For the first time in 15 years, the man who had spent his entire adult life protecting everyone around him had just been protected in return. Not through force, not through strategy he'd planned himself, but through the same quiet, overlooked attentiveness that had let a catering company's invisible auditor notice a hidden blade half a second before it mattered. Desmond, zip-tied and furious on the floor, looked up at Hannah with the particular venom of a man who'd lost everything to a woman he'd never once considered a threat. "You should have stayed a waitress," he said. "Nobody ever thinks the dangerous one is the woman holding the tray," Hannah said. "That's always been the mistake." Desmond Cole's betrayal forced Alexander into the same impossible reckoning he'd avoided for 15 years of running an organization built on loyalty he'd never once tested properly. And this time, with Hannah watching him work through it, he refused to make the decision alone. "He's been feeding Holbrook information for at least 2 years, Alexander said, the evidence spread across his desk the morning after the confrontation. "Maybe longer. I trusted him with things I never questioned, and the entire time he was helping the family that nearly destroyed you to stay protected." "What happens to him?" Hannah asked. "That depends on whether justice or example matters more to the people watching," Alexander said grimly. "There are men in my organization who'll read whatever I decide as exactly how much betrayal actually costs in this life. Some debts are paid in blood, Hannah said quietly. I don't think this one needs to be. Exposing what he did to Senator Holbrook publicly costs him considerably more than disappearing quietly ever would. Alexander chose, in the end, public exposure over private vengeance. Desmond's betrayal, along with Senator Holbrook's complicity, delivered not through violence but through a carefully documented dossier that found its way, within days, to 3 separate investigative journalists who'd spent years trying to land exactly this kind of story. The senator's political career collapsed within the month. Desmond disappeared from the city entirely, his name marked permanently among Alexander's organization as the cautionary example of exactly how loyalty curdles once it has a price tag attached. The Whitfield's reckoning came publicly, deliberately, in the same gilded ballroom where Hannah had once stood humiliated in a wine-soaked dress. Alexander arranged it for the Foundation's next scheduled event. 200 guests gathered again, the same chandelier light catching the same marble floors. Except this time every guest in the room had already read the morning's headlines about the Foundation's laundering scheme before they'd finished their first glass of champagne. Gregory Whitfield arrived expecting damage control. He found instead federal investigators waiting near the entrance. The documentation Hannah had assembled months ago now forming the backbone of a case that would strip the family of their foundation, their charitable standing, and considerably more of their fortune than they'd anticipated losing. Connor's punishment proved less satisfying to everyone watching. Stripped of his position within the foundation, publicly disgraced, his name now synonymous with cruelty rather than privilege. But free, still wealthy through trust his father couldn't touch, his cruelty answered with consequence but not with the complete ruin some of the gathered guests clearly believed he deserved. Some people think he got off easy, Hannah said, watching Connor leave the ballroom under a barrage of camera flashes and shouted questions. His composure entirely collapsed. Some people are probably right, Alexander said. I could have made sure he lost considerably more than his reputation. I decided that wasn't actually justice. It was just revenge wearing a nicer word. Why? Hannah asked. Because you didn't ask me to destroy him, Alexander said. You asked me to expose the truth. That's worth more to you than vengeance, and I'm not going to take that choice away from you by deciding he deserves more pain than the truth already cost him. It was the moment Hannah's careful, guarded respect for him finally tipped into something she could no longer pretend was only gratitude. You could have used all of this to make yourself feared in this city forever, she said, watching the ballroom slowly empty around them. Instead you let me be the reason this story gets remembered. That was never a difficult choice, Alexander said, closing the distance between them. Your father saved my life and asked for nothing in return. I think the only way I was ever going to repay that debt properly was making sure his daughter never had to disappear the way he did to survive it. You've spent 15 years carrying a debt nobody asked you to keep, Hannah said quietly. I think it's paid now. I think, Alexander said, I'd like it to become something else entirely if you'll let it. 2 months later, the Whitfield Foundation's Gala Hall reopened under entirely new management. A charitable trust Hannah herself now oversaw, every donation tracked through an auditing system she designed specifically to make the kind of fraud that had nearly destroyed her impossible to repeat undetected. Hannah walked into the trust's inaugural fundraiser not in a catering uniform, but in a deep garnet dress she'd chosen entirely for herself, her father's old leather ledger, restored now, the cracked spine carefully repaired, displayed on a small podium near the entrance as a quiet, permanent reminder of exactly how the Foundation's reckoning had begun. The auditor who took down the Whitfield Foundation and a state senator in the same season, murmured a guest near the bar, careful in a way few people had ever bothered being around her before. I'd be lying if I said that doesn't make every donor in this room considerably more careful about where their money actually goes now. Good, Alexander said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. Priya found her near the entrance, beaming, having left Bramwell Catering entirely to join Hannah's new trust as its events coordinator. The board wants to know if you'd consider a permanent directorship, she said. Apparently somebody finally noticed what you've been capable of this whole time. Tell them I'll think about it, Hannah said, though they both already knew the answer. Alexander found her by the same ballroom windows where, months earlier, she'd stood frozen in a wine-soaked dress while 200 people laughed. The city lights scattered gold across the harbor beyond the glass. The same harbor near the old Harrow Street warehouse where a debt had first been incurred 15 years before either of them understood what it would eventually cost, or repay. He pressed something small into her hand, not the leather ledger which already had its place, but a slim silver pen, old and well-used, the kind a careful man might carry for decades without ever needing anything fancier. "It was your father's," Alexander said. "I kept it after Harrow Street because it was the only thing of his I had left to hold on to. I think it belongs with you now more than it ever belonged with me." Hannah turned the pen over in her palm, remembering her father's voice from a lifetime ago, the steady, unwavering phrase that had quietly shaped every quiet, careful audit she'd ever conducted without fully understanding why. "Numbers don't forget even when people do." "He never told me what kind of man he actually was," she said quietly. "I think I understand it now. He was the kind of man worth 15 years of someone looking for his daughter." "He was," Alexander agreed. "And she turned out to be worth considerably more than even he probably expected." He kissed her there in front of the same harbor view, in front of donors and guests, recalculating in real time exactly how much they'd underestimated the woman who used to clear champagne glasses without anyone bothering to learn her name. An older guest near the bar who'd attended Whitfield galas for over a decade raised his glass and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "They underestimated the wrong waitress." Got a quiet laugh. It also happened to be true. Later, as the gala wound down, Senator Holbrook's name came up once more in a quiet conversation between Alexander and two of his remaining captains, not about consequence already delivered, but about exactly how far his political network's protection of the Whitfields might have extended before Desmond ever got involved. It was a loose thread neither of them mentioned to the room, tucked carefully away for a season when the city's fragile new balance would inevitably need defending again. Hannah Mitchell had spent 6 years being told, in 100 small, cumulative dismissals, that she was furniture in rooms built for people who'd never bother learning her name. She understood now, standing in a ballroom full of people who finally, completely saw her, that she had never actually been furniture at all. She had only ever been unseen, and the people who learn hardest how to stay unseen are very often holding, quietly, the exact evidence a room needs to finally tell the truth. If this story kept you holding your breath, you know what to do. Hit like, subscribe for more, and if you think the Crestwood underworld has more secrets left to expose, you're probably right. Drop a comment. Do you think Connor's punishment matched what he actually did to her that night?